Hi, everybody, and welcome to Spring 2021 edition of English Night, our semi-annual awards and capstone presentation event, coming to you, as so many things are these days, via Zoom. For those of you who don't know me, you can probably tell from my little name thing here, but I'm Dr. Barbara Liu. I'm the chair of the English department. This is actually my last semester as chair and the last English night that I will be the host or master of ceremonies for. And so I'm looking forward to a great evening, and I hope you are too. We're going to start with our awards today. And so one moment, I just wanted to do one other thing before I start, and I think it's too late. That's okay. No big deal. We have several awards that we give to graduating seniors each year, and actually 6 awards. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the award and the person who's receiving it. So first of all, we have the award for service to the department. This award is given to a student who's helped with departmental projects, coordinated events, or organized student clubs that have connections to English studies. And this year, our award winner is Julie Orenberg. Julie has worked in the department office for the last 4 years, and she's been cheerful, competent, and diligent in her support of our department secretary, Miranda Lau, and all the faculty and her fellow students. Miranda describes Julie as passionate about her work, and she consistently shines in a way that merits this award. So congratulations, Julie.
Thank you.
The next award is the award for lifelong learning. This award is given to a student who's a returning or continuing student who's shown a steady love of literature, writing, and the pursuit of knowledge. This year, the award goes to Nicole Marcus. Nicole was nominated by Dr. Polly and by Dr. McDonald, who both noted her exceptional abilities as a critical thinker and writer. Dr. Polly noted that Nicole approaches each assignment by asking not what would be most expedient, but rather what would be most interesting and challenging for her. Similarly, Dr. McDonald described how in her feminist theories course, Nicole consistently prioritized issues of nationality, colonialism, capitalism, and access, and was a key contributor and humble leader in an activism project focused on reproductive justice. Furthermore, Nicole has contributed as a teacher assistant and has made presentations in a range of classes to talk about the research and rhetorical strategies she's employed in her own projects. In these ways, Nicole has shown a steady commitment, not only to her own learning, but to that of her peers as well, making her more than deserving of this honor. So congratulations, Nicole.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Next, we have the award for contributions to the cultural life of the campus, which is given to a student who's been actively involved in literary publications, theater, or other literary and artistic events on campus. And this year that goes to Liz Cologne. Drs. Garcia and McDonald nominated Liz. They both noted that her work organizing Eastern's Take Back the Night event and her work as a teaching assistant in Intro to Women's Studies, memoir, and other classes. Dr. McDonald also commended Liz's leadership in the National Organization of Women and her frequent participation in Fine Arts Center events. Dr. Garcia highlighted Liz's presentation at Olas's Boricua Paint Night event. And I'll add that in only her 3rd semester at Eastern, Liz was one of the 2 interns overseeing the English department's social media and our Keeping in Touch newsletter. Her involvement and leadership in all these aspects of campus life exemplifies the kind of well-rounded student this award is meant to honor. Congratulations, Liz.
Thank you so much.
You are most welcome. Next, we have the award for excellence in teaching or tutoring. And this is given to a student who's excelled in teaching internships, the Writing Associates program, or other teaching experiences. This award this year goes to Oscar Garcia. Writing Center Director Rita Malenchik nominated Oscar for this award, stating that since his sophomore year, he's been a tutor in the Writing Center and an English 100P, and a teaching assistant in other courses such as Dr. Flood's FYI 100. In all of those capacities, he's used his knowledge and experience to meet working class students and students of color where they are and bring them into the world of university writing. His work in this respect has been exceptional. His hard work and experience as a tutor, as well as his excellent academic engagement, has earned him acceptance into the graduate program in rhetoric and composition at UMass Amherst this coming fall. And of course, it has earned him our appreciation and this award. Congratulations, Oscar.
Thank you.
You are welcome. Next, we have the award for an outstanding future educator. And this award is given to a student who's achieved academic excellence while completing a double major in English and early childhood, elementary, or secondary education in order to prepare for a career in teaching. That award this year goes to Julia Mckinnon. Julia is majoring in both English and secondary education and was nominated by Dr. Speicher, who first met Julia in the Summer Research Institute, where Dr. Speicher says Julia was immediately impressed, or Dr. Speicher was immediately impressed by Julia's seriousness of purpose, her willingness to try new critical approaches, and her strong writing skills. In later classes, Julia continued to impress, and her contributions in class consistently advanced discussion and showed her willingness to ask difficult, open questions. Finally, says Dr. Speicher, Julia's exceptional content knowledge, enthusiasm for learning, and intellectual curiosity promise to make her an incredible and inspiring English teacher. Congratulations, Julia.
Thank you very much.
And you've got your own fan club there with you. Excellent.
That's my mom.
Yay, Mom. All right. And lastly, we have the award for academic excellence. This is given to a student who has demonstrated superior ability in and dedication to English studies. And this award goes to Natalie Devlin, who unfortunately, I do not believe can be here. Oh, no, you are here, Natalie.
She's right here.
I'm here.
Yay, for some reason I was thinking you weren't going to make it. Okay, so Natalie, in addition to her major in English with a concentration in secondary education, she's also a major in history and social science, as well as minors in anthropology and business administration, all while maintaining a very high GPA. Dr. Garcia, who nominated Natalie, described how her research and writing were exceptional in English 204, Intro to Writing Studies, and her kindness and good nature made her a pleasure to have in class. While 2 majors and 2 minors certainly keep her busy, Dr. Garcia also commended Natalie's active involvement in the Best Buddies organization, a student club that matches volunteers in mutually enriching friendships with persons with intellectual disabilities. Clearly, Natalie has achieved excellence and is deserving of this honor. Congratulations, Natalie.
Thank you so much.
You are welcome. So now I am going to turn things over to Dr. Ferrucci, who will make the presentation of the awards for first-year writing students.
So I am here, but I didn't know I was going to be presenting. So I'm going to go someplace where, the kids aren't around. And
Sorry about that. I thought you knew.
All right. So I think I'm someplace where no one will interrupt me. All right. So yeah, just very quickly, each semester we give out awards to first-year writers whose writing is excellent in some way, whether it's a creative piece, whether it's well-researched or some combination thereof. And we're really looking for writers that really engage with the audience in sophisticated ways. And this year's winners are representative of that excellent work. The first, Paige Stegna, for her essay, Book Censorship and the Right to Read, and Christiana Blank What If I Pursued My Childhood Novel, which was actually the introductory essay to her portfolio, where she reflected on her experiences as a writer. These winners receive a fancy certificate from the English department and a small stipend and a book chosen by the instructors in those classes. So congratulations to them.
Congratulations. And so congratulations to all of our award winners. And it's a pleasure sharing these awards with you. Oh, I wanted to add too that for our English department senior award winners, they receive a fancy certificate as well and copies of the Pulitzer Prize winners for fiction and poetry from last year. So they will be getting those prizes. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to be turning it over next to Dr. Clermont-Ferrand. We will be commencing with our capstone presentations. 2 students from each of the 2 sections of English 462, the second semester of our capstone, will be presenting about their projects. And Dr. Clermont-Ferrand and Dr. Pauly are the instructors for those sections, and we'll begin with Dr. Clermont-Ferrand. Go ahead, Dr. Clermont-Ferrand.
Oh, thank you. I'm like Nixon. I don't know if my mic is on or not. All right, so I wanted to say a couple of words just about what I had asked the students to do in this capstone seminar. So as most of us know who are here, the goal of the senior sem and the capstone is to formulate a cohort that gives students the opportunity to generate a high level learning in a collaborative environment. And in our section, I asked students to call upon their literary and analytical skills that they had developed through all their hard work leading up to their capstone experience. And the title of our seminar was Gender and Sexuality in Medieval Literature. And they were asked to engage with at least 2 primary works, something dating from about the year 700. I think we capped off at about 1400. And to review the scholarship specific to that subdiscipline, and then to apply one of the 3 optional literary critical theories, which was gender, queer, and/or feminist theory. And then to engage in the ongoing critical debate that we typically read a little bit more passively in courses below the capstone. And they were brave enough to venture into this seminar on gender and sexuality in the Middle Ages. And I definitely wanted to praise them for their willingness of spirit, because medieval literature often has what we might call a branding issue, because popular perception drives the idea that medieval writers worked in some distant, polluted, plague-riddled world where the elite maintained their privilege by loyalty to a leader that was not always compos mentis, and they perpetuate that oppression of the vulnerable by laws and institutions. Nothing at all like what we have lived through recently. And my students were also able to push through the perception that medieval literature has this high bar of entry. There are all the peripherals of history, the details from the Judeo-Christian tradition, manuscript variants, dialects of Old and Middle English, and all their accompanying translation sometimes gives students pause and think, I'm going to take that monsters class instead. That sounds way more fun. And what we tried to do is dig through those, and we added to that they now have bragging rights that they have read, understood, and used texts like Judith Butler's Undoing Gender, Eve Sedgwick's The Epistemology of the Closet, and Tyson Pugh's Queer Medievalism in their seminar length papers. And after 2 semesters, they can now write and think fluently about how sex and sexuality are treated in medieval texts, both the more official ones, and as Max will talk about in his presentation, texts that discuss a more subversive register. They can talk about how contemporary scholars work with medieval literature and how that is historicized with our contemporary critical sexual studies. And I think all of them now can talk about how it's not just a post Judith Butler world that considers gender identity and sexual orientation social constructs that writers probe at now. They understand that writers in English have explored spectrums of gender and sexuality since the foundation of English literature as far back as the 6th century. And they did all of this heavy intellectual lifting, the modality that may or may not have been completely comfortable for them, and certainly wasn't their planned modality. And I know I can speak for all of us in the English department to say how proud we are of all of them. And I think Dr. Liu has abstracts from our section that she might put in the chat so you can see what the whole class did. Our class chose 2 speakers for tonight, and the first one is Tori Congdon, and this is Tori's bio. She gives herself a little bit of, she doesn't give herself enough credit, so I tweaked it a little bit. She's a graduating senior who in fall 2021 will be an MA candidate at Central Connecticut State University in their English literature program. And at Central, she'll also tutor Shakespeare and work in the University Writing Center. Tori says when she grows up, she wants to publish a full-length memoir or coming-of-age novel. And when she's not interpreting Middle English, she's known as the player Beef in Among Us. And she'll talk to us tonight about gender and sexuality in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So I'm going to hand it off to Tori.
Thank you, Dr. Claremont, and thanks everyone for coming. And also happy birthday to Liz Cologne. I'm gonna go ahead and share my PowerPoint with everyone and get this party started. So my paper is titled, I'm a Mirror Ball, Gender Nonconformity, Homosocial and Homoerotic Bonding, and Phallic Imagery in the Canterbury Tales. First, I think it's important to discuss my title briefly because until 1897, the mirror ball did not exist. The title actually comes from a lyric in the song Mirror Ball by Taylor Swift off of her Folklore album, and it's a song about reinventing yourself. Thematically, I thought that this song was really fitting in relation to how in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, gender nonconformity, homosocial and homoerotic bonding, and phallic imagery is used to explore the dissonance within the varying gender expression of a multitude of characters while revealing Chaucer's own beliefs about 14th century gender norms within himself. Now, this isn't an original idea. It piggybacks off findings that scholars before me, like Carolyn Dinshaw and Tyson Pugh, have made, but I thought this was a topic that was important to do further studies on because the Canterbury Tales has 32 characters and more than half of them are glossed over in this gendered light. So in order to conduct this research, I broke my paper into 4 main sections: gender conformity and gender nonconformity in the Canterbury Tales, relationships, symbols, and gender, and finally, Chaucer the man versus Chaucer the poet, or Chaucer the pilgrim. Although it depends on the country, gender roles can be found codified in law, education, religion, the arts, and in texts generated by or about 14th century political and social institutions. Within this literature, the 4 main archetypes seen in male characters are heroic masculinity, Christian masculinity, masculinity within courtly love, and intellectual masculinity. Unfortunately, information on women and femininity is scarce. The perception people have now of gender and women in medieval times specifically stems from the popular feminist movements that started in the 1960s. The reality of it is that the attitude towards women most likely come from the writings of clergymen. In the Middle Ages, men considered women as a danger because they were allegedly being polluted by sex, which caused a lack of respect towards women in this androcentric society and created them into objects instead of people. In my research, I couldn't justify any female character to be conforming towards their gender based on the context given, so this section was geared towards male characters that I found to be prime examples of gender conforming, the monk and the clerk. Based on these male archetypes, due to his physical nature and affinity for hunting, the monk would fit into the heroic male archetype. As for the clerk, he is an example of the intellectual male archetype because he didn't care much for his appearance, but rather cherished his love for philosophy instead. Being a gender non-conforming individual doesn't mean you completely denounce masculinity or femininity as a whole, but rather it's a mix of everything in between. Gender is a performance and you get to decide how to act it. For example, the friar is technically both the intellectual masculinity and the Christian masculinity archetypes because of his position, but his goal in this position is to help and forgive members of the parish. And he has more of a kindness and openness in regards to his actions, which are typically feminine leaning traits. On top of his actions, he's given both masculine and feminine traits, which doesn't inherently mean that he denounces his male identity, but just that he doesn't always perform masculinely. As for the reeve, because men typically did not care as much about their appearance as women did, his care towards his appearance is a trait that is non-conforming to male expectations. However, the reeve's anger and passion was not uncommon in males, and it's helpful to him in his line of work of managing an estate. The reeve also studied carpentry, so he falls into a gray area of masculinity, where even though some traits he exhibits are masculine, he presents very femininely, causing him to not fit into any archetype. In addition to their descriptions in the general prologue, there are a few notable interactions that the friar and the reeve have that solidify their gender performances. One predominant image used for the friar is the rote, a string instrument that takes on a phallic shape, which hints that as well as having relations with women, he may also enjoy the same relations with men, which isn't heterosexual in the slightest. Similarly, the giving and lending of the reeve's possession may simply just be the giving and lending of the reeve himself to the lord he works for, which would be the objectification of the reeve's body as an instrument for the lord's use. Additionally, the imagery of a coat and hood is a form of yonic imagery. Furthermore, in the interactions they share, the friar has a playful relationship with the summoner. In the friar's tale, the summoner forms a brotherhood with the yeoman, which alludes to the idea that the friar wanted to become closer with the pilgrim summoner. With the reeve, his relationship with the miller is much different. In the miller's tale, the miller pokes fun at the reeve's carpentry past while making the carpenter's wife cheat on him. Speaking of wives derogatorily flusters the reeve because this topic is a stressor, especially since the reeve is not as open about himself as the friar is. The reeve's tale openly incites violence against the miller, as well as the wife and the daughter. This acts as a microaggression towards the reeve's self-perception. The reeve is resentful that he does not conform towards his gender, or that he is in a relationship with a man where he takes a feminine role. So instead of bonding with the miller, he can only lash out because he views the miller as more of a man than he is. After looking at the many ways in which characters in the Canterbury Tales do not conform to their birth assigned gender, it's worth asking how Chaucer may have viewed himself through the lens of gender nonconformity. The description that poet Chaucer writes for Pilgrim Chaucer resembles a description one would write for a woman. Similarly to the reeve, Harry Bailey, the host of the trip, consistently ridicules Pilgrim Chaucer, which leads to two scenarios. One in which Pilgrim Chaucer is so comfortable with his gender and sexual performance, it makes Harry Bailey wish that he were not as masculine and more gender non-conforming. Or two, Harry Bailey exists to belittle Pilgrim Chaucer because that is what author Chaucer may have done to himself as someone who was stuck conforming to their birth-assigned gender and was resentful. Now, a safe conclusion to this paper would be that gender is a spectrum, and because of the subjective nature, it's seen differently by everyone. But in reality, this begs the questions, if multitudes of gender expression are so heavily intertwined with the Canterbury Tales, what else are we missing from medieval literature, whether it has to do with gender nonconformity or not? Gender is a broad concept that is applicable to almost any narrative. So by looking at how gender is used in an important work like the Canterbury Tales, we can then ask ourselves, what are we missing from history as a whole if we refuse to acknowledge the importance of gender? Thank you.
All right, and so next from our class, Maxwell Chase is going to read. I've got a bio for him. Max is a proud English major who also studies communications and plans to be a journalist in the automotive industry. He is captain of the men's lacrosse cross country track and field team and is the 2021 recipient of the prestigious Francis Geisler Male Sports Person of the Year Award, granted to only one senior male athlete. Max is also a member of Sigma Tau Delta and Omicron Delta Kappa Leadership Honor Society. He enjoys running, hiking, and spending many hours sitting on the quiet floor of the library completing his assignments. That I can absolutely attest to. And so Max is going to talk to us about another way to use gender and sexuality to interpret the Miller's Tale in particular. So I'm going to hand it over to Max.
Thank you, Dr. Claire, my friend. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint here, and then we will commence. Okay, so I'm going to be reading a little bit of an abridged version of my capstone project. So I'll start with the introduction, a bit of it, and read my thesis, and I'm going to go through each of the sections of my argument and read from two of them. And the PowerPoint is really not the focal point of this. It's really my reading. The PowerPoint just kind of adds kind of visual to what I'm presenting. So without further ado, I'm going to begin. What do the crude and heavily sexualized fablio of 14th century English writer Geoffrey Chaucer reveal about his inner thoughts and desires? Chaucer famously authored the Canterbury Tales, a collection of poems centered around a unique cast of characters, all exhibiting their own personas and attributes. 6 of the 21 tales are fablio, a type of characteristically sexual and obscene comics that originated in the French language, one of these being the Miller's Tale, which is the focus of this analysis. These fictions are quite prominent because of their unique subjects and content that are infrequently encountered in other works of the era. These are sexuality, vulgarity, and the exposition of private affairs, which are all fair game to Chaucer, and he employs them thickly. There has been a rapid expansion of the study of gender and queer theories over the past decades, and inquiries have been made into the Miller's Tale using these critical perspectives. This paper will expand upon those inquiries by making a claim about Chaucer himself after analyzing the parallels between the status quo of 14th century society and the written content of the tale itself. In the Miller's Tale, Chaucer consistently tweaks character subscriptions to establish gender roles, defies heteronormativity, and challenges both masculinity and femininity. This results in characters who challenge the social acceptability of the time, exhibiting numerous gaps, overlaps, and dissonances in their sexuality and gender expression. The constant differentiation of characters from the norm exposes Chaucer's personal trait as a sexually curious individual that, like the characters in this fablio, wander from the era's societal norm. So let's see if I can get this PowerPoint. Okay, so these are my major body sections, and I'm going to kind of read a kind of a rundown of each of them here. Each section of my argument is unique, yet cohesive and poised to contribute to the extraction of meaning from this fablio. Reading it through the lenses of queer and gender theory pioneers uncharted discourse on centuries-old literature. My thesis opens with the first body section, 14th century norms. This section briefly explores the societal context of medieval England, explaining the religious and secular laws and norms that Chaucer would have been aware of. The understanding of these finds application to the Miller's Tale in my second and third body section. The inventive value of this historical research acts as a key towards unlocking a completely fresh understanding of Geoffrey Chaucer's innermost feelings when applying their understanding to the text. The second body section, dubbed Queering the Fablio, employs queer theory to read the characters of the fablio and discover qualities about their characters and motives from this critical lens. This section will investigate how many of Chaucer's characters stray from heteronormativity and towards homosexuality. The third section, solidity of gender roles and lack thereof, is the third section of analysis and deeply dives into Alison's role as a female character that constantly challenges the societally prescribed gender roles of the era. Finally, nonconformity as Chaucer's literary sword is the title of the fourth and final section, which deeply dives into Chaucer's mind, detailing how the use of gender and sexual nonconformity within his writings are not just characteristics of the poems, but are instead outward reflections of a sexually transgressive author, expressing both his internal feelings and reflecting upon the society in which he lived. Jumping forward to section 2, which analyzes the Miller's Tale through queer theory, there's a much deeper queer relationship between characters Nicholas and Absalom than Chaucer presents on the surface, although he doesn't endeavor much to hide his existence. After fooling Absalom into kissing Alison's rear end, he decides upon rising to relieve himself so that, quote, he could improve upon the jape and make him kiss his arse ere he escape. Now, Nicholas presents himself as a hyper-masculine individual, one who easily engages romantically with Alison while simultaneously taunting Absalom. But unlike the religious categorization of queer men at the time as effeminate, Nicholas is actually a very masculine queer individual who lusts for both Alison and Absalom alike. This overcompensated masculinity of Nicholas closely aligns with Tyson Pugh's argument about Harry Bailey's masculinity in his article, Queering Harry Bailey, Gendered Carnival, Social Ideologies, and Masculinity Under Duress in the Canterbury Tales. Nicholas's identity, quote, is presented to the reader as insistently masculine, yet ultimately queered from its normative foundations. Pugh provides the pertinent framework for the idea that Chaucer deliberately characterized queer characters as masculine, but further understanding of the societal context adds credence to the point that motivations existed which pushed Chaucer towards writing characters inspired by the social norms of society. The queering of Nicholas has direct relations to the societal and religious norms of the 14th century that Chaucer would have been aware of. In direct rebuttal to the religious idea that sexual others were effeminate and unmanly, he wrote Nicholas as the exact opposite, a crude, farting, masculine individual, one hoping that Absalom would kiss his rear end. Then, much like the transvestite prostitutes of the era detailed by John Reichener, who slept with both men and women, Nicholas desires both Alison and Absalom and thus solidifies himself clearly within a triangulation of desire, a concept defined by queer theorist Eve Sedgwick, which I have made a visual representation of in this PowerPoint slide here. The existence of a transvestite prostitute in England, many of which existed, is examined by the article Sexual Deviancy and Deviant Sexuality in Medieval England. Coupled with the existence of a character like Nicholas who desires both men and women, this proves that Chaucer endeavored to accurately represent the social practices of the 14th century while rejecting the religious notion of emasculating queer characters. Now I'll move ahead to the final piece of my argument, which is a culmination of the points made by the previous body sections. The 14th century was certainly not a time of widespread secular law mandated heteronormativity like the religious organizations of the period wished. Transgressive sexuality was latent within society. Look no further than the aforementioned account of John Reichener, the transvestite prostitute who regularly engaged with members of society from all walks of life and all levels within the social hierarchy. Transgressive sexuality existed on a wide scale, and Chaucer knew this. The popularity of the Canterbury Tales adds credence to the existence of this widespread interest in societal engagement with non-traditional gender and sexual performativity. Geoffrey Chaucer himself was a sexually transgressive individual and created the fabula such as the Miller's Tale not as an exploration of the boundaries of societally acceptable sexuality, like Glenn Berger argues, but rather as a manifestation of his own sexuality and transgressive interests. The content of the Miller's Tale, specifically the numerous gaps, dissonances in the gender and sexual performances of the characters, is Chaucer's expression of his own sexuality. The push and pull between challenging and reinforcing the societal norms discussed in sections 2 and 3 is a clash between Chaucer's untamed imagination and the powerful forces of heteronormativity which go against his free personality. Chaucer's motivation behind writing the heavily sexualized Miller's Tale and all of the Fablio isn't due to any pressure from society to write a certain type of way, but is instead to share the enjoyable musings of a sexually transgressive individual with a society that is full of them. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Dr. Liu, did you want to take questions now?
Yes, I think we have about more than 5 minutes for questions, if there are any questions from the audience for either Tori or Maxwell. Actually, I will ask one. being quite ignorant on this topic. It's been since I haven't read the Canterbury Tales since I was an undergrad in the early 1980s, and nobody was looking at queer theory and feminist lenses and so on back then. So Max, my question's for you, but maybe Tori can chime in as well. So I was wondering what evidence other than his writing in the Canterbury Tales, etc., is there that Chaucer himself was sexually transgressive?
That's a very good question. Because it wasn't really, it's hard to find recorded history from that time period, and there's not really anything that Chaucer would produce himself besides his authored writings that would really clue you into that he was a transgressive, a sexually transgressive individual. But I thought that the research that I did that uncovered the fact that there were transvestite prostitutes at the time who interacted with people from all levels of the social hierarchy, from religious individuals to people in government to people on the street, kind of clues me into the idea that it wasn't really all that uncommon to have people who were transgressively sexual, even though there are lots of religious and secular law pressures that go against that. But as I get into in the full version of my thesis here, there really wasn't much actual prosecution of transgressive sexuality as much as you can read in and look at secular law showing that there were laws against it and things like that. There really wasn't any prosecution. And because of the accounts from the transvestite prostitute, it's evident that most of the people who will be prosecuting this or against it, religious figures, are actually the ones taking part in activities like that. So I can't really answer your question definitively on what evidence, and I'm sure there's a lot more out there, but for me, I think that connecting all of this evidence from the 14th century to his actual writings was enough to convince me.
Okay, great, thanks. Anybody else have any questions for Tori or Dr. McDonald?
Hi, I wanted to say how much I enjoyed both the speakers and listening to their talk. And I was hoping that either or both might be willing to talk more about the metaphors that they used for gender and what work those metaphors did. So we had Tori with gender as a mirror ball. We had Maxwell mentioned gender solidity. So we've got solidity on one hand and a kind of shimmering from Tori. I'm wondering if the writers can talk about how those images helped them bring together different elements of their paper and their thinking. Thanks.
I can go. When I was just doing the reading of the Canterbury Tales and reading through different perceptions that other scholarly articles had, and first of all, like, gender is a spectrum, so like this is just how I perceived it. But you know, there's so many like in the text metaphors, like the phallic imagery I pointed out, and just in the relationships that the pilgrims have with one another, based on what we learned from like Judith Butler and Eve Sedgwick, and even in like a basic queer theory textbook by Lois Tyson, just through like these like scientific definitions of what gender is, I found it really easy to place these terms with certain relationships that the pilgrims had with one another. I don't know if it's necessarily like metaphors. I found the mirror ball really interesting because it shows, like, a mirror ball shows you every version of yourself. There's so many like shimmering sides to it, and there's so many like shimmering sides to gender, really. So gender through how you outwardly perceive it, how, like, say the friar dresses more femininely or more masculinely depending on how he's feeling, or even like the reeve, he also perceives more femininely, like he just like how slender he is, or even how Chaucer wrote himself as like doll-like. So it was really interesting to read those kinds of things and see how just people perceive themselves differently. You perceive yourself differently. So in a context, like in a gendered context, how you perceive yourself more masculinely or femininely day by day. That's for me how I went about it.
I'd have a very similar response to that. I think that, first of all, only one of my sections really touched on the gender, so it was very limited in terms of the characters that I engaged with. I engaged with mostly Allison from The Miller's Tale, which is what I worked on. And mostly in terms of the metaphors and everything, when I use solidity, I only use that term because looking at the historical context of masculine or feminine kind of roles in that era, I looked at that in my 14th century norm section. And then the interesting thing about Allison is that she shifts through feminine kind of descriptions when he introduced her, but Chaucer also gives her very masculine descriptions in other parts of the tale. So that I was trying to kind of highlight the non-solidity of the way that he describes the gender roles of the characters in the fablio itself, if that helps at all. That was kind of the way I used it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question if anybody has one. If you have a question, you can either let me know in the chat or raise your virtual hand, because I can't see everybody. We're hanging over onto more than one screen. But we do have time for one more question if anybody has one. Going once, going twice.
I was gonna hang back because I'm about to start talking about our seminar instead, but I do have a question that comes out of these two really great presentations. I don't know if you'll be in a position to answer this. So if the answer is I can't talk about that, that's fine. I understand. But I've been sort of fascinated watching in the past couple of years as my colleagues at other institutions that that I see on Twitter and whatnot, who are medievalists, have sort of grappled with the ways that people try to appropriate the medieval past for certain contemporary agendas, right? So I would like to say congratulations. There are people who would be horrified at the vision of the Middle Ages that you just laid out, and I am here for it, as they say, right? So I was just wondering how you found approaching this material that lots of people seem to want to read very conservatively, from this other angle. Did you find the material resistant, or was it the sort of thing that once you began looking, it seemed just totally obvious and everywhere? Or what was it like in encountering, these very old texts through a fairly contemporary, fairly recent set of theoretical developments?
I can go first. Well, I think one of the beautiful things about the major that we all love and celebrate is that it's really up to your interpretation. It's really all, I think of it like this, like you have a puzzle essentially that the Miller's Tale is, and the walls around the puzzle are not flat. They have pieces, almost like the exit of a piece sticking off of it. So you can have puzzle pieces that are conservative that you can kind of stick onto that and you can look at it in that way. Or you can have puzzle pieces that fit into other places of the poem that are from gender and queer theory perspectives, and they all fit in really. You can look at it any sort of way you'd like to, but there's certainly like the kind of the methodology of this is just taking a look at other texts from theorists and looking around and finding ways where the defined terms of the theories kind of fit in. And I found, and from writing the paper, that they fit in pretty well. And you could make a pretty convincing argument, as I think I have, about the existence of these things in that era, even though they weren't defined in that certain type of way. Even by the contemporary interpretation of it, I still think that they fit in pretty well to this text and other texts from the era. Because humans haven't changed, really. This is, our nature hasn't. So like, this has all existed. It's just the way we define it. So that would be my answer to this.
I did want to, just one second, Tori, I wanted to recap the conversation we had last night. We rehearsed last night in our last senior seminar meeting, and we actually had a similar discussion to this because the International Congress on Medieval Studies starts next week. And as Dr. Pauly says, it's changing somewhat, but it can be a little conservative. And we did discuss how if Max and Tori presented there, I would have to walk them to their car because they would get jumped by somebody who was furious at what they were saying, particularly about Chaucer as a person. It's almost like a little bit more permissible to say it about Nicholas or Allison or the Friar or the Reeve, but yeah, so yes, you are absolutely right.
I don't know how much more I can add that hasn't already been said, but for those who have read the Canterbury Tales, it is a pretty, it's very dirty humor. I told my sister I was doing my thesis on this, and she was like, it was blasphemy. She was like, isn't that dirty? And I was like, that's why it's fun. So, I mean, I found it really easy to apply this theory to the Canterbury Tales because of the humor that Chaucer interlaced within his tales and whatever. So it's all up to interpretation, but I have found my research in this topic specifically really enlightening. I think a lot of medieval literature can be used as historical context for what people were like in those time periods. I talked to like historian friends who look at like queer and gender theory in history classes, and they say the same thing too. There's a lot of uncovered ground because of how conservative scholars in the past have been. So I think it leaves a lot of room open to look at these texts in this light.
And you raised those questions very well at the end of your presentation, Tori. I like how you had those questions about, what are we missing when we're not looking at things this way? Thank you, Tori, Max, and Dr. Claremont-Ferrand so much. That was great. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pauly, and he'll introduce his seminar and his presenters.
Thanks, Dr. Liu. Our seminar was called Imagining Monsters, and it considered what monster stories can tell us about the cultures that produce them. In the first semester, we examined a range of monster stories from the Anglo-Saxon period up till literally last year. And broadly speaking, our discussion of these texts and films was structured by two principal themes that we derived from Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's suggestive essay, Monster Culture, 7 Theses. And so first, as Cohen says, the monster's body is a cultural body. So a monster embodies or incarnates the fears and anxieties of the culture that imagines it. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, for example, a malign force steals into England from the supposedly backward realm of Eastern Europe and seduces women. The zombie of Haitian voodoo conjures a nightmare of enslaved labor that's perpetuated even after death. Secondly, Cohen emphasizes that monsters provide ways of imagining boundaries between the human and the inhuman, between the permissible and the impermissible. The monster tells us you can go this far, but no further, even as monster stories allow us to imagine what might lie beyond those boundaries. So the students in this seminar have produced just a wonderful variety of projects that come at these questions from a range of angles and in different forms. And I believe Dr. Liu has abstracts that she can share as well. There's several works of literary criticism. Both Caroline Early and Kevin LaFrance, for instance, examined the ways that Maria Devana Headley's 2018 The Mere Wife reimagines the archetypal English monster story, Beowulf. In different ways, Caroline and Kevin draw out how Beowulf's monsters become Headley's protagonists and how The Mere Wife interrogates the concepts of heroism at the heart of Beowulf. Nick Balin's paper explores a related blurring of the lines between monsters and heroes, finding that superheroes who loom so large in our popular culture resemble classic monsters in many key ways, though with a positive valence. They achieve what we only wish we could. And in her examination of Stephen King's The Shining, Olivia Sidman argues that the supernatural horror that's so prominent in that text serves, in fact, to externalize the book's real terrors of alcohol abuse and domestic violence. Other projects took the form of cultural critique. In different ways, Angelica DeRosier, Caitlin Filingeri, and Julie Orenberg, whom you'll hear from later, all examine the figure of the serial killer, a person who commits monstrous acts, but who looks just like you or me. Why, these papers ask, is our culture so enthralled by serial killers? How do we read the numerous films, both fictional and documentary, that present serial killers as objects of both horror and fascination? Rochelle Mckinnon, who's a double major in English and poli-sci, examines representations of and rhetoric surrounding racial violence and police brutality through the lens of monstrosity to ask how we ought best understand the legacy of pervasive racial injustice. And Nicole Moavero draws out the ways that the now long-running celebrity feud between Taylor Swift and Kanye West, carried out over social media and fandom sites, has come to be structured as a monster story, with partisans on each side rooting for their heroine or hero to overcome the monster that she or he faces. I learned a lot of things in this class. We also had a number of creative projects this year. Liz LaCourie and Lisa Rondinelli, who will be reading in a bit, have been working on fiction in the fantastical tradition that uses non-human monsters to refract human questions and concerns. Kayla McLean's Black and Blue, on the other hand, works in a realist vein to explore how generational trauma can make a family's lives seem haunted by something monstrous and unpredictable, something prone to frightening eruptions of violence. Kirsten Rasmussen's project moves between these two poles of the fantastical and the realistic, working in both poetry and prose to imagine the perspectives of non-human monsters on the one hand, and also the conditions that can lead ordinary people to do monstrous things on the other. And finally, Emily Rainville, who's a future elementary school teacher, has drawn on the monster story's attention to physical difference as a marker of otherness in a read-aloud book for young children like her future students, that tells the adventures of a Google-eyed pug named Apollo, who must ignore the naysayers if he's to fulfill his dream of being the first pug on the moon. Spoiler alert, he makes it. So I can't possibly do full justice to the projects in this short amount of time, so I'll refer you to the abstracts that Dr. Lewis posted for a somewhat fuller picture. I'll turn things over to Lisa and Julie in just a minute, but I do hope everybody will congratulate me in congratulating all of these students. Everybody will join me in congratulating all of these students, because designing and carrying out a capstone project like this can be a rewarding experience, but it's a strenuous experience under the best of conditions. And I think, as we've all experienced, a year-long global pandemic is far from the best of conditions. So despite not even being able to commiserate with each other about the stresses of senior year, except from 6 feet apart and wearing masks, this group has really managed to stick things out and produce a really thought-provoking body of work. It's just been a real pleasure and a privilege for me to watch these projects come together in the last few months, and I am very much looking forward to seeing the finished products next week, by the end finals week, 5 p.m. Thanks. So I'll hand things over to Lisa, and then Julie will follow.
Cool. Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa. I'm a senior at Eastern, so very excited to graduate. I have an undergrad in English, and I'm also going to be doing secondary education with English when I go for my graduate program. I'm going to start this summer, so I'm very, very excited. And I just want to thank Dr. Polly for introducing everybody. Everybody's projects were just phenomenal this semester, and it's just so cool. It's just such an opportunity just to be here with you guys today. So I hope you guys enjoy. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, I'm just gonna hide this. Okay. So mine was called The Pride Before the Fall. And so what kind of piece is this? This is a creative writing piece. And the genre is dystopian, futuristic, and a sci-fi kind of creative writing piece. And I was very excited to write a piece like this in the first place because I just love creative writing. And so when this class offered this opportunity, I was beyond excited to do this. So yeah. So what is the synopsis of this short novel? So Earth is suffering from a severe sustainability crisis that is in desperate need of help. Eve is a volunteer who decides to go to space to find a solution to the crisis, and her dad is an in with the government that allows her to go in the first place, and Eve is the protagonist of the story. Her mission lasts approximately 1 year. She is unsuccessful with her mission, but she does end up finding another substance that she thinks is cool and takes back down with her to Earth. Uh-oh. What happens to Eve when she gets back to Earth? So everything is now severely overgrown. And how did this even happen? Well, there was an explosion while she was away, causing everything, including people's very own DNA, to be altered and mutated into half monster, half human beings. So it's the complete contrast of when we first started. So what now? Society splits into 4 factions or groups while Eve is away. And so the first faction or group is the Seers, and they are firm believers in faith, and they live a devout life to prayer and to fasting, and they live in overgrown forests. The second one is the AI. They are firm believers in technology, and they consistently try to mutate themselves to the extreme with it. And they live in pristine cities of technology as well. The third one is the underground. They're the anti-government conspiracy theorists. They were the only ones that were not affected by the explosion, because when they caught wind of the government's plans, they thought that the government was going to orchestrate the plans, and they went underground ahead of time to prepare for the explosion. So therefore, they are the only ones that were human because the explosion never affected them or their DNA. And the last one is the government, which is quite literally the government. In the story, they are just severely, corrupt, and they don't desire anything but control. They have the most severe monster-like mutations in their mannerisms and such. So what happens to Eve? Well, it is daunting, but she has to clean up the mess of society, and that is the end goal of this story. So anyways, why should you read this book? It's interesting because it's based on many current groups of society that clash quite harshly today. They're then taken to an extreme and placed in a dystopian setting to make it quite the read. The characters are all very interesting too. Each one has a very specific personality quirk and trait that doesn't make them 2D in a sense. They're very interconnected with one another, whether it is secretive or not. And it stems from a very real issue of sustainability today and the direction we're heading in as a society. I believe many readers could relate to the dysfunctional dynamic of Eve's household as well. And the main protagonist is female, if you do like a female lead. So, anyways, what was your inspiration to write this? I identify as Christian, and my identity is largely tied into that. There are many Christian undertones to this and my own personal struggles I have faced in my own past in different situations. So I sometimes wrote through Eve vicariously, which helped me to craft a 36-page creative writing piece in the span of a semester. My significant other was also a huge help in collaborating with me for just so many ideas and just bouncing back and forth, and just really motivated and supported me. He also did the cover art for the first slide of this presentation. I just think it's super cool. So I give credit to God primarily, and of course some to him as well, just for being so supportive. Yeah. Introducing the characters to the story. There are many, so please bear with me. Eve is the protagonist of the story. Mara is her dead sister. Hadassah is Eve and Mara's mother. Lucius is Eve's and Mara's dad. So those 4 are the family. Abijah is Eve's boyfriend and with the underground. Joanna is Abijah's mom, but she's only mentioned a couple times. Sarah is another one of Eve's love interests and a leader of the Seers, and anybody who is in bold is a leader of one of the factions. Gabriel is Zara's assistant and a co-leader of the Seers. Naomi and Sophia are also guards of the Seers and also help Eve get to the underground. Elijah is the leader of the underground. Amos is the leader of the AI, and Jasper is the leader of the government. So why the asterisk over Mara's name? She's never alive during the time period of the story. We get a couple flashbacks, mentioning her, but we really don't interact with her or really see her. So we never see her in real life, and yet the absence of Mara in Eve's life is actually a major catalyst for how she got up into space. It affects the dynamic of the family, how she perceives the world to be, and the mark it has left on her. So you guys can have a snippet of writing that I would love to read to you guys. So anyways, a crash came from the balcony. Abijah whirled around and made a break towards the sound. I pursued hot on his heels. Finally, he burst. The AI have come, he said, outstretching his arms. Other members of the underground stood their ground. Many still had their silver armor on. Others began to file in from behind me, weapons at the hip, fanning out in the air as they flew upwards towards the enemy. The earth had been uprooted. The sun shone brightly from above, exposing every corner of the balcony that lay naked to the hungry eyes of the mechanical creatures with their mechanical wings and their mechanical DNA. Yes, youth, Abigail rolled around looking at me. His eyes seemed to glow with the fervor. I looked at them in awe too, he laughed. Their power and their might is unmatched. Those that willingly choose to modify themselves with technology, those that are unafraid. Amos, a voice boomed. What business do you have here? A man roared. He must be the leader of the underground. Out of nowhere, I felt Abijah's hand snake over my waist. Get off of me, the words erupted from my throat. I shoved his hand away from me. Seconds later, a battle cry sliced the air. Naomi had jaw pinned, shoving him off of me. I come to possess your territory, Elijah. The dark voice of Amos dripped and oozed into the hearts of those around me. I heard the skirmish between Naomi and Abijah cease from behind. Amos's black eyes now pierced the whites of mine. I felt my body involuntarily flinch. He looked back at Elijah. If you don't agree, we will have no other choice but to take you by force. So, yeah. Any questions or comments? That is my presentation.
We'll wait for questions until after both presentations, if that's okay with you, Lisa.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Of course.
Well done.
So we'll turn things over to Julie next, and then Q&A for both presentations afterwards.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right. Okay, so tonight I've been given the wonderful opportunity to showcase what I've worked on all semester, Imagining Monsters. If the title doesn't give it away, I did focus on the monstrous body of the serial killer and what I ironically titled Celebrity Skin, the contrasting representation of the serial killer. I'd like to begin by pulling out the beginning segments of my paper to just dig deeper into context. It is a terribly intrusive thought that monsters could walk among us every day. There are monsters who walk around the public eye who look like us, act like us, smile with us, laugh among us. More often than not, we lack the cognitive awareness that these kinds of monsters are even deemed as monsters themselves, because monstrosity can exist within us and among us. Humanity and its capabilities can be equally, if not more, wicked than the fictionalized characters we've come to study for centuries. A prime example of this is the realm of serial killing and how they seem to weave right into our culture. Serial killers are typically juxtaposed as the awful, atrocious monster of a being or the quiet, charming fellow in the neighborhood. These are the strikingly contrasted ideas of who these people are, or at least perceived to be, to the public image at face value and how they're portrayed in popular culture. Such popularization and interest sparked among notable specific killers, particularly in the 1970s with the infamous Ted Bundy case, or Jeffrey Dahmer in the early 90s, for their sickening and gruesome serial sex murders, all of which have several documentaries, films just as recent as 2017's My Friend Dahmer, or 2019's release of Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, which is based on the Ted Bundy case. The most recent adaptation of Jeffrey Dahmer will actually be streaming Netflix. This was announced March of this year, titled Monster: The Jeffrey Dahmer Story. It is worth noting that these films chose to cast popular stars in film and television to represent Dahmer and Bundy, namely three teenage heartthrobs that you might recognize, such as Zac Efron, Ross Lynch, and Evan Peters, who's notably known for his infamous roles in American Horror Story. Evidently, these killers and their most heinous acts of violence are continuously remembered for their unimaginable crimes and lifestyles, and this drives the question if attention and spotlight put on these serial killers is essentially encouraged by the media itself, further allowing these monsters to thrive comfortably in a surrounding culture. To start expanding on this idea of a monster taking on a sense of local stardom, Joseph Grixty, in his piece called Consuming Cannibals, Psychopathic Killers as Archetypes and Cultural Icons, provides a sound example of just how easily a serial killer can transcend into this sense of stardom. The notorious serial killer I mentioned prior, Jeffrey Dahmer, was actually deemed the main hero of a comic book series that had gained popular traction in 1992. His serial sex crimes involved cannibalism with male victims, and this comic book had sold out instantly in his place of origin in Wisconsin, and there was a sequel planned, and this definitely triggered a lot of imminent backlash. And the publisher had actually claimed at the time he only profited $200 from that comic book, and argued to direct the anger at those who are writing books and making movies about the killer, because they will be making thousands of dollars. Now, the publisher addresses the bigger issue here way beyond local success. Grigsby makes the interesting claim here that those already immersed in a position of power will then have the ultimate say as to how these hideous individuals go fictionalized and recreated. So when a consumer culture latches on to these fictionalized individuals, they do transcend into the horrifying to the understood, and are only to be further reproduced for a desensitized culture to absorb. So with this, my thesis, a culture driven by capital, constantly seeking to produce and recreate through film, essentially encourages the identity, understanding, and overall notoriety of a serial killer. And by result, the various narratives leave a culture with different adaptations weave between fact and fiction, creating various depictions of serial killers, either the charming or the wicked. So next, from here, I feel it's necessary to give a little bit of a concrete definition of what a serial killer is. United States Congress in 1998 did define serial murder as a series of 3 or more killings having common characteristics such as to suggest the reasonable possibility that these crimes were committed by the same actor or actors. Yet there's still an immense chunk of gray area that exists in the territory of serial murder based on a killer's motivations that's most often driven by psychological, biological, and sociological factors. One cultural argument that I did find worth mentioning and ties into my bigger project is how feminist social theorists actually designated the phenomenon of serial murder as a symptomatic sin of the patriarchy, given that the United States, I found, has definitely more of a rigid structure of both patriarchal capitalism and homosexual oppression. I believe this does play a heavy contribution in terms of the boomerang here and to the framework of serial killing, in which we do see culturally embedded beliefs then going to encourage and raising the serial killer itself. Another interesting connection I did make through my paper is through David Schmid's Natural Born Celebrities, in which serial killers adopt a celebrity-like persona. This is given through the 20th century America, where they began to diverge concepts of fame and being a celebrity, where today we see a lot of celebrities being praised for superficial attributes like simply cultural visibility rather than having actual merit. So ultimately, we must question if the celebrity just simply equates to that of a visible being in a culture. What does this necessarily mean for the monstrous ones? So this then leads me to the main serial killer I focused on this semester. His name is Ed Gein. You may have heard him, and if you haven't heard of him, you've heard of his influence on the popular characters such as Norman Bates in the movie Psycho, Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, that are all scattered throughout the 20th century. Uniquely enough, each of these characters in film do display and resemble that of Ed Gein in his case in a plethora of different ways. So the 2 contrast representations I did choose to focus on is the character Norman Bates to that of the chainsaw killer Leatherface. This is based on the way both films and their unique aspects illustrate Gein's madness to the physical elements of his crimes, and then in 2 different ways that it's represented through film. So to give a brief synopsis of the character Norman, audiences are immediately met with a polite, shy, meek-mannered young man who owns this motel business. And it's through the secondary character here in this picture, Marion, who actually provokes Norman to her untimely death, unfortunately, when she addresses his domineering mother figure who evidently shelters him off from the world. And it's this pivotal scene that I chose to analyze in my paper to reveal later on that Norman was responsible for her murder, as well as entering a state of psychosis just like Ed Gein did, and decided to dress up as his motherly figure and adopted her persona entirely, which is revealed at the end of the film. So here the film goes to represent a nearly uncanny comparison here between the toxic relationship between Norma and Norman Bates, and then Ed Gein and his mother. both playing a crucial role in negatively impacting the psychological development. As for the next, Norman Bates in Psycho is definitely what saves us from the guts and gore. However, Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we are not as lucky. So it's this character, Leatherface, in this adaptation of Gein's story that gives us the real scare of the big, massive butcher on an isolated farmhouse, making any and all attempted slaughter, wearing a woman's wig and a mask made from human flesh, which is something that Gein was known to do. Unlike Psycho, however, there's no origin backstory to explain what exactly is motivating this killer. Instead, audiences are simply just given an hour and 30 minutes of pure shriek terror. Thrasher inflicted on 5 teens killed basically in a domino effect. And this film definitely, I felt, takes on Gein's story in the most hideous light of absolutely no remorse. And it's simply just a skin masked killer on a massacre, nothing more, nothing less. So from analyzing these two contrasting films, I do want to revisit the anecdote of the publisher of Dahmer's comic book, where he warned it wouldn't be the local success to elevate these killers, but rather the film directors in Hollywood who would go to profit thousands of dollars. This isn't necessarily to blame the film directors of Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre in this case, in attempts to make cinematic success. However, this does go to feed my thesis in which a popular consumer culture, as well as a culture littered with patriarchal ideals, not only encourages and inspires the serial killing, but also ranks them into a celebrity status based on their cultural visibility in particular film representation. And so this monster that lurks among us will thrive in secret spotlights forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Will you unshare now? Thank you. All right, so excellent. Questions for either Julie and or Lisa. And oh, James, I see your hand up. So James Goodmanson, you have a question.
Hello. I have a question for both. It's not simultaneous. I have 2 questions, one for each. For Lisa, how long was the character in space for all of that to happen while they were away? Did you mention that and I missed it? I don't remember.
Yes, I did. 1 year.
Okay. I just feel like that's a lot to happen in 1 year. Personally, all the establishing, like maybe you could even do it that, like, not that I want to be like alter your story, but I think maybe it would be beneficial that it's like her or maybe like a team of people is sent up into space and they're cryogenically frozen because they're like, oh, we got to get to this one place that might have the thing we're looking for. We know by the time we come back, everyone that we know is going to be dead and gone. But hopefully humanity will still be surviving by the time we get back. And then by the time they get back, maybe it's been like 50 years or so. They're like, oh my gosh, it's way worse than we thought it was going to be. I don't know. That was just something that I was thinking of.
No, I think that's honestly a really good suggestion. I'm open to that. So thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think that would make more sense too, considering the time period. So thank you.
You're welcome. And as for Julie, do you think that perhaps a lot of the way that killers are presented in popular media, it almost aids itself to the more modern phenomenon that there's a lot of more sympathy for monsters typically. Like I know Mary Shelley's Frankenstein definitely like has sympathy for the monster there too, but it just feels like a lot of the time a lot of modern concepts is that there's more sympathy for the monsters, try and make them more human or misunderstood, like how the villains in Batman are typically portrayed as, oh, they're horrible people that murder everybody, but they're misunderstood because they're mental patients and we can't treat them we can't treat them like murderers or anything. We just got to imprison them in a asylum. Or I know this isn't literature, but in the video game Undertale, the main thing is that you're supposed to feel sympathy for the monsters and that's the whole subversion of the video game genre that it's in, is that you can have the choice to either kill the monsters or spare them and make friends with them, based on how like the writing is sympathetic, portrays them in a more sympathetic light. And I feel like that there's some sort of shift that it was like monsters were more of a dramatization of society's fears, or what is it? Not stereotypes, but there's a word I'm looking for that's similar to that. But then it seems almost that there was a shift somewhere that led to sympathy for the devil, basically. And I'm curious if you think that perhaps these portrayals of serial killers as human but horrible humans, it's like, oh, I don't know, lended to that, I guess. Shrug.
I definitely see, I do think there is a sympathy behind certain killers. A lot of my paper, I go to explain, there's obviously the fascination link between trying to find any justification as to, why people murder, why people choose serial murder. I did mention how, I do find it very interesting that a lot of, especially recent media, chooses to pick, popular movie stars, teenage heartthrobs, where I wonder if almost that has a role to play in the fascination behind that. So that's why I included that in there. And just in terms of like Psycho, I'll reference Norman Bates. That was a movie where versus Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you're just getting the raw, the killing, the slasher horror film, where Norman Bates, you're getting this, very shy mannered individual. You think he's very meek mannered, not a killer. And so you are seeing like the aspects of, I guess a serial killer's development. And I guess I can understand like why like people then go to, I guess, sympathize for the killer. I don't know exactly when, I guess in the decade that turning point happened, but that's, I guess, my best explanation.
Sorry, Andrew McIntosh has his hand up.
Hey, everybody. I just I had a question for Lisa. I thought your story was incredible. I thought I could like see it as a movie or something. I thought it was really cool. But my question was, I thought it was really interesting how you said your faith influenced your writing in such a great way. And my question was, in what ways, like in what themes and different ways of the story was Christianity kind of bled into your story?
That's a phenomenal question. So first of all, one thing that I did, just the names themselves were all, they all have biblical meanings just in itself. So obviously you take Eve, you go back to like Adam and Eve. And I found it quite interesting because they're like the first ones, if you go back to that story, they're like the first ones ever to come to Earth. And then it's kind of like she's more of like the last one now in the story to be kind of on Earth, or like the last kind of person, that comes from space, at least. So that was one thing I did, and they all have names. Even the snippet you guys read, but the character's name was Amos in that. It means like burden in Hebrew, and so he carries the burden of technology in that sense too, tying in faith into technology in the world. And even looking into the machine itself and the solution, and how she has to get to the end of the story and like run and put the solution in the machine to like get everything back to normal. With the story of Christianity, the vial is kind of out of this world, and looking at the Savior in Christianity, it's kind of like out of this world, like looking at Jesus and that figure, so quite literally that she's getting the solution from space, which is someplace out of this world, and then she has to put it into the the machine, and then get through Jesus to get to heaven in that sense. So those are just a couple of things that relate to Christianity too, that probably make the most sense given the context and the story and the snippet of writing that I gave. But you'll have to read the rest to see it. It's really cool, so I highly recommend. 10 out of 10. But good question.
Awesome, thank you. I will definitely read the rest of the story. I'm excited.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question. I see Emma's hand up.
So my question is also for Lisa. I hope to do a creative piece in the fall. So I'm kind of just curious about your writing process, and like obviously you had to have hit a wall, I think, at one point with like writer's block. And how did you overcome that? And how did you handle the criticism? Because like that's your baby. So I'm like just curious.
That's a really good question. So my writing process, oh boy. um, I honestly, like I said in my my slideshow, I honestly just talking just with someone, you know, just really helped. Just a back and forth conversation and just getting the input from somebody else, especially someone who's close to me, you know, obviously it helps a lot. And just having that deep conversation about what it could possibly be and just that creative writing process. So for me, it was just sharing with you know, someone that, you know, I love and just helping me getting through that process. So just talking out in general, honestly, just helped me a ton. I feel like that would help you too. I feel like reading aloud in itself as well. So not even just like, you know, like reading with your eyes, but like physically out loud at times too can help. I would set aside blocks of time where I would just be like, all right, I'm dedicating this day to, I'm gonna write. I don't know how much I'm gonna write, but I'm gonna write on this day. I'm just gonna sit down and do it. And I would personally make sure I usually didn't have many other assignments that day, so I could just focus solely on the story and be in that headspace to do that. And in terms of when I faced writer's block, again, I honestly just shared my ideas saying, what do you think? What do you think? Because honestly, I don't really know. And then I would get input that I didn't even think of, or I was like, oh, I forgot to put this in. And so honestly, just talking it out was probably the biggest thing for me, and just setting aside the right times and intervals to kind of do it really at the end. And I think you mentioned, I'm sorry, I think I missed your last one. You mentioned criticism. Can you just repeat the last part of that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you took criticism, because I know in like other creative writing courses, I kind of get I get like a little butthurt when someone like goes at certain parts. So I just was curious how like you kind of got past that stubbornness of like, no, this is how I want it.
Oh, okay. The stubbornness how I wanted it. Well, first of all, I had motivation from the get-go. I was like, I want to do a creative writing piece. I just love creative writing. And this opportunity was just so like perfect for it. So when I kind of had like the green light, I was kind of like, okay, I'm gonna do it my way. Also, I have to give credit to Dr. Polly. He was honestly, he was really open to like, you know, helping and suggestions. And I personally didn't receive, you know, that much resistance or backlash or anything like that, or the and things like that. So I feel like just the openness, I guess, of him, and just my intrinsic motivation to just like put it on paper, I guess, is kind of what yeah, I guess my personality. You know, I don't know. But yeah, those are all phenomenal questions. So, and good luck with your story too. I'm sure it's gonna turn out awesome. So
thank you.
So I'm teaching the section of 461 this semester that will be 462 in the fall that Emma's a part of. And so I'm going to ask Julie, there's some students in that class who are going to be working on, you know, other kinds of projects, not creative projects. Can you give them a sense of what your writing process was like, and how you overcame, you know, some of the difficulties, blocks, criticism, etc.?
Yeah, a lot of difficulties came from, again, like Dr. Polly was saying, it's an extensive piece that you're working on the whole semester. So a lot of times going back into it was honestly the hardest part, and keeping track of, you know, where you're heading and seeing, I guess I'll phrase it, the light at the end of the tunnel. You know, you see where you are at page 6, but you don't necessarily know where you're going to end up at page 20. So I guess in terms of staying organized was a big thing for me, and kind of chunking out. We did a note card activity where kind of sectioning elements of our paper, and that helped me a lot, because it was very hard for me to see that connection and where I was going to take it. So that's something that helped me, just keeping organized, especially with your sources. And yeah, that's probably my best advice.
Okay, thanks, Julie. And thank you, everyone. I think it's time to wrap up. So a quick final hand of applause for all of our presenters who really presented some awesome projects and again, I had put links in the chat earlier for the abstracts for all the other students in those sections of the capstone. And so those are, if you missed the links, those are on our department website. If you go to the academic resources and then the capstone seminars page, you can find where those abstracts are linked. So if you didn't get a chance to download them or go to the links now and you're interested later to see the descriptions of the works that other students in those classes did, you can find them there. So thanks to all of our presenters. Thanks, Dr. Claremont-Ferrand, Dr. Polly, and thank you to everyone else who was here to support these students. And I wish you all, those of you who are graduating, wish you all the best in your future. And to everybody, I wish you all a great summer and have a good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.